In July 2026, the Israel-Palestine conflict still feels painfully present. Gaza remains a humanitarian disaster. The West Bank is still shaped by occupation, settlements, raids, violence, and displacement. International legal scrutiny is also still intense. In 2026, UN human rights reporting warned that Israeli actions were raising concerns over ethnic cleansing, while Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu remained the subject of an ICC arrest warrant over alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. And around the world, people still argue not only about borders and security, but about what this conflict even is. That last part matters more than it first seems, because Israelis and Palestinians do not only disagree about the future, they often disagree about the meaning of the same past. To many Israelis, 1948 means independence and survival. To Palestinians, 1948 means catastrophe and displacement. The same war sits at the center of both stories. So how did one war create two national stories? That is the missing context. And if you do not understand that, later arguments over occupation, refugees, Jerusalem, settlements, recognition and statehood can start to look like endless chaos instead of what they really are. An unresolved argument over what the founding moment itself meant. To understand that, you have to start before 1948, but not too far back. This episode is not really about ancient history. Ancient ties matter emotionally and symbolically, especially in a place with so much religious and historical weight. But the modern political conflict takes shape much later. For centuries, the land was part of the Ottoman Empire. It had an overwhelmingly Arab population, with cities, villages, families, religious communities, and local identities rooted there. It also carried deep Jewish historical and religious significance. That distinction matters. There were long-standing Jewish ties to the land. But there was not yet a modern state of Israel, and there was not yet an independent Palestinian state in the form people argue about now. The conflict becomes modern when modern nationalism becomes modern. That is where the story really begins. In late 19th century Europe, Zionism emerged as a political movement for Jewish self-determination. It grew in an age of nationalism, empire, and rising anti-Semitism. For many Jews, especially after repeated persecution in Europe, the idea was not abstract. If Jews were going to be safe and politically secure, they needed a homeland of their own. And for Zionists, the land of historic Israel was not some random destination. It was understood as an ancestral homeland. At the same time, Palestinian Arab political consciousness was also taking shape. The people living in the land did not see it as empty. They saw it as home. So from very early on, the two national movements were not simply moving toward different futures. They were increasingly moving toward the same land. That does not mean they began as perfect mirror images of each other. They did not. They emerged under different conditions, with different power, different outside backing, and different political fears. But both became serious national projects. And once that happened, empire became the force, trying and failing to govern between them. After World War I, Britain took control under the Mandate for Palestine. This is where a lot of the later conflict hardens. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration had supported a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, while also saying that the rights of existing non-Jewish communities should not be prejudiced. That sounds balanced on paper. In practice, it was not stable, because the same territory was now being governed under commitments that different communities understood in profoundly different ways. Jewish immigration increased. Arab fears increased with it. Communal violence grew. British officials kept searching for formulas that might preserve order, but they were governing over two national movements whose core political goals were increasingly incompatible. This part is crucial. Britain did not create every cause of the conflict, but it governed the territory while trying to manage a problem that was becoming harder to contain every year. By the 1930s and 1940s, the question was no longer whether the conflict was serious. The question was what political shape could survive it. Then came 1947. The United Nations proposed partition. The idea was to divide the territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under a special international arrangement. This is one of those moments that later arguments often oversimplify. A common version is, one side accepted peace, and the other rejected it. That leaves out too much. Jewish leaders accepted partition in principle because it offered a path to statehood, even though many were unhappy with the proposed lines and knew the plan would not solve everything. Arab leaders rejected it because they did not see why a land with an Arab majority should be partitioned in a way that handed so much territory to a Jewish state. So partition did not settle the problem. It sharpened it. Violence escalated almost immediately. What followed was first a civil war inside Mandate Palestine, and then after Israel declared independence in May 1948, a wider war involving neighboring Arab states. This is the emotional center of the episode, because this is where the same war becomes two different national stories. For Israelis, 1948 is tied to statehood, survival, and national birth. That is not just patriotic language. It is rooted in a real sense of existential vulnerability. Only a few years after the Holocaust, many Jews saw the war not as a contest over one more border, but as a fight over whether Jewish sovereignty would exist at all. In that memory, the war is inseparable from survival. Crowds celebrate independence. A state is declared. An army holds. A people that had been politically powerless in Europe now has a state of its own. That is why 1948 sits so deeply in Israeli national identity. But for Palestinians, the same period is remembered as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And here the emotional logic runs in the opposite direction. The war is not remembered mainly as liberation. It is remembered as loss. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced. Communities were emptied. Many villages were destroyed or depopulated. Refugeehood did not become a side note to the conflict. It became one of its defining facts. This is the line that matters most. The same war became Israel's founding story and the Palestinians' national catastrophe. That is not a rhetorical trick. It is the core explanatory fact. And it helps explain why people can look at the same year, the same war, and the same land, and feel that the world keeps misunderstanding what happened to them. For many Israelis, outside critics often seem to minimize what 1948 meant as a moment of survival and self-determination after centuries of vulnerability. For many Palestinians, outside discussions often seem to talk about Israeli independence while softening, minimizing, or bypassing the scale of Palestinian displacement and loss. That is why the conflict's memory structure is so hard to escape. The two sides are not only disagreeing over what should happen next, they are also defending incompatible moral meanings of what already happened. And the argument did not end in 1949. The war ended with armistice lines, not a final peace. The refugee question did not disappear. The political claims did not disappear. The sense of unfinishedness did not disappear. Then came another major turning point, 1967. In the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, along with other territories outside the immediate Israeli-Palestinian frame. This matters because 1967 changed the political map in a way that still shapes every serious diplomatic argument. Occupation became central. Settlements became central. Jerusalem became even more contested. Security became even more entangled with sovereignty. Palestinian daily life in the West Bank and Gaza became part of a different, later layer of the conflict. So if 1948 explains the founding split in national memory, 1967 explains why the conflict's territorial structure still feels unresolved in the present. Nearly every later peace proposal runs into the same set of problems: borders, Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, security, recognition, and trust. Or rather, mistrust. That part is important too. People sometimes ask why peace efforts have failed so many times, as if the answer must be one bad leader, one rejected offer, or one side that never wanted peace. Reality is harder than that. Each failed effort sits on top of structural problems that were never easy to solve in the first place. What borders would a state have? What happens to Jerusalem? What happens to Palestinian refugees and their descendants? What happens to Israeli security fears, which are not imaginary, and which draw real force from Jewish historical memory? What happens to Palestinian demands for dignity, sovereignty, and return, which are also not imaginary, and which draw real force from displacement and occupation? And what happens when every new round of violence strengthens the people on both sides who trust compromise the least? That is why this conflict can feel both intensely current and historically trapped. As of July 2026, arguments over Gaza, the West Bank, settlements, recognition, occupation, and security are still not separate from the past. They are downstream from it. The humanitarian emergency in Gaza is happening now. The political struggle over the West Bank is happening now. But the meanings people bring to those realities were shaped long before this year. That is why outside audiences often get confused when they look for one clean origin story or one clean moral summary. There is no version of this episode that responsibly says one side has history and the other has propaganda, or one side's memory is real and the other's is fake. That is too shallow. The harder truth is that both peoples built national identity around the same war, but around radically different experiences of that war. And once that happened, the conflict became more than a fight over land. It became a fight over legitimacy, memory, and justice. That is also why the topic is so emotionally charged outside the region. People are not only arguing policy, they are often attaching themselves to one historical story and treating it as the whole story. But if you flatten the history into only independence, you miss the Nakba. And if you flatten it into only dispossession, you miss why Israeli statehood is experienced by so many Jews as inseparable from survival. That does not solve the conflict, but it does explain why the conflict persists. It is not simply because the two sides have no history. It is because they have history so central to their identity that each side often feels the world understands the other side's story better than its own. That is the missing context. One land, one war, two national stories. And until those two stories can at least be understood, even when they cannot be reconciled, later arguments over borders, refugees, settlements, security, recognition, and statehood will keep running back into 1948. If you like my content, please like and follow for more.